everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related material where I attempt in 10 minutes to answer a question from a reader, viewer, or listener. You can ask us a question, you can send us an email, you can send us a postcard, you can comment on a previous video or podcast, you can back us on Patreon, one of 3 different levels, Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. Now, today's question is from M. Rook E. Ward, and he writes, without any data in front of me, it would appear that heavier armoured or protected troops seemed to be able to make light troops relatively ineffective. I don't recall European armies being decimated by missile-armed troops, the Battle of Carrhae being one of the few exceptions. Is that a false memory of mine? Whereas Persians, for example, had a predominance of missile troops, and I've assumed, again without data, this is because of their enemies tended to be lighter and more mobile, horse archers, for example. This seemed to play against them later. How else would an outnumbered Macedonian army survive against a shower of arrows, slings, and javelins? So, with these potentially false and unsupported assumptions, it's not just the social prestige of being wealthy enough to be armed and armoured and in the ranks of the heavies, but the ability to see off threats of light troops long enough to force a battle decision in melee by the heavies. Do we have data to support, to debunk that? Okay, I think we do, but it's a peculiar one, and it comes down to all sorts of interesting assumptions as well. So there are examples of armies being defeated by missile troops. The Battle of Sphacteria being one. You mentioned the Battle of Carrhae. There's also the Battle of Lycaeum, where the Peltasts of Victories defeat a Mora of Spartan hoplites. Now, there's also, I think, an issue with battles where missile fire is indeed devastating, but we either don't have the sources that survive, or we have sources which eschew how the defeat occurred and just talk about the defeat. Now, why is that? And why don't those units who've been effective get employed? And in some cases, again, they do, but they are not Roman. They are auxiliaries, foederati, and they're not mentioned or emphasized in the sources, with a couple of exceptions, but we'll get to those hopefully. Right. Now, the second part of your question, how else would the outnumbered Macedonian army survive against showers of arrows and slings and javelins, for instance? Now, in that case, when you talk about the Macedonian army, when Alexander invades the Persian Empire with maximum 40,000 men, 9,000 men in the phalanx, when he's fighting battles, they're suffering incredibly low casualty rates. And I think it's more about the effectiveness of Greek armor in general to stave off the effects of Persian javelins, arrows, and slings. Secondly, I think that the upturned sarissa of the Macedonian phalanx also disrupts the flight. There are people who don't think that, who disagree with that, but I think the numbers of casualties would suggest that that must be happening, because they're standing for quite some time under enemy fire and not suffering casualties. Or if they are not serious enough to stop them fighting, which is interesting in itself. So I think that's probably what is happening, and therefore these missile weapons are not as effective against Greek armoured troops. And you can sort of see the Kardakes, the Greek armoured Persian troops that are trying to adopt that. And then, of course, you've got in the Roman Empire, they're even more heavily armoured than their Hellenistic phalanx contemporaries. Now, I want to get back to, I'm going to circle back, using all these modern terms, circle back to the idea that there are several battles where Roman armies, for instance, are defeated by missile enemies, but that's not emphasized in the source material for whatever reason. So firstly, the battles of the invading Goths. Now, interestingly, written recently about the Battle of Abritus and also about the wars of Marcus Aurelius and others, the Marcomannic Wars. When we get to Vegetius in the 5th century, I think he's writing late 4th, after the Battle of Adrianople, he talks about the lessons learned by the Romans from Goth and Hun archery. Now, the only context he can really be talking about there is the Goth archers in the periods when they are invading the Roman Empire. So 250 Geneva, the Battle of Abritus, all the way through to Fritigern and the Goths in the late 4th century in the 370s. And so the victories that they earn over Roman armies seem to be missile-based ones. That at Adrianople, for instance, it's not only mistakes by the Romans, and that seems to be the thing that our sources emphasize, that the Romans, and Valens in particular, makes mistakes. Yes, okay, but the Goths still win the battle. So it's not that Valens lost the battle, it's that the Goths won it. And I think I've spoken about that before. And it's something in our sources that our Roman sources like to emphasize Romans losing. They're not really willing to recognize Goths winning. And I think the Goths win the Battle of Adrianople. And they've won other battles before. You know, there's the Battle of the Willows. Come on, Brain, there's another battle in that time to Belgium. They win those battles as well. And I think they are missile-based victories. That once at the Battle of Adrianople, for instance, the Goths surround the Romans, it's with missile fire that they decimate them and destroy them. And again, I think that the victories won by the Goths in 376 and 377, it's missile-based. And at the Battle of the Willows, the Romans are only able to sort of withstand because they form into a testudo on the battlefield. And that gives them protection against missiles. Now, again, that's not emphasized in the sources. We're told that they form testudo, but why would you form a testudo against non-missile fire? There's no need to be protected because, you know, if it's against melee heavy infantry troops, you shouldn't have to form a testudo. You could lock shields in a frontal wall, but you don't need to form a testudo. So it's a testudo because there's missile fire causing havoc. And so I think there's that those are missile-based victories that are not being emphasized in the sources. Similarly, the Huns. Now, again, the one big battle of the Huns that gets emphasized at the Battle of Chalon or Catalonian Fields or whatever you want to call it in 451, which is a tactical draw, really. But there are battles before that, many battles before that throughout the 430s and 440s that the Huns win. And they win that by missile fire. And those victories, again, are Hunnic archers, Hunnic horse archers, defeating Roman armies. So, and again, the sources emphasize Romans losing, not Huns winning. And I wonder if there were more sources that survived in better shape if we would get more detail. Because what we've got is we lost all of these places. The Huns were unstoppable. They reached here. We lost this battle. We lost this battle. We lost this battle. We lost this battle. We lost this fortress, this fortress, this fortress. So in those terms, you've got large numbers of defeats of Roman forces by Hunnic horse archers and lassos and other things. So all sorts of stuff's going on there that the sources don't really give us enough information on. But I think the main weapon of the Hun is the bow, and that's emphasized in Ammianus and several other sources. So there are lots of battles that, and again, coming back to that point, that why not then adopt them? And I think the Romans do, but they're adopting, you know, they're hiring Gothic foederati and Gothic archer troops, and then Hunnic foederati. And we do occasionally get how effective they are. For instance, in the battles of Belisarius, we do hear about how effective his Hunnic foederati are when he invades Vandal North Africa, for instance. But again, they're not the prestige troops. They're not the Romans. They're not the heavy infantry and the heavy, well, in Belisarius' case, the heavy cavalry army. They're foreigners under your employ. And so the sources don't really emphasize them. Procopius luckily does mention them. And you've got several other snippets and insights that suggest that they are battlefield effective missile troops. And so I think, again, from a status perspective, the status of the heavy infantrymen and the heavy cavalrymen remains, regardless of these victories against them by missile-armed troops, because that's not the status. And there are blips on the radar of, no, still we've got the high-status troops. But they got defeated. Well, yes, we lost that battle. It wasn't a victory by the barbarians against us. We lost it for various reasons. And often those reasons are not tactical or strategic. They are the religion. Valens, for instance, is blamed for losing the Battle of Adrianople because he's an Arian Christian, not for any other reason. You're like, well, that's not really useful. So I think there are a lot more victories of missile armed troops against our, heavy infantry enemies than we think, and we're just not told about them. So I hope that answers your question. So join me again for another Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.